Welcome back to another edition of the Heart to Heart podcast. And my guest today is Todd Shapiro. So Todd's very well known in the psychedelic space, mostly well known for his work with Red Light Holland. So Todd, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks, Doc. I really appreciate being here, man. And I see your clips all the time, and you get great guests. So I'm just privileged to be here.
Well, thank you so much for saying that. I appreciate everyone who watches the show or watches the clips. So thanks again for saying that. But I'm really excited to chat with you today. I actually haven't done a psychedelic episode in a while, even though I'm like super into psychedelics and what they can do. And over the last few months, there has been, a few different developments, whether it's Robert Kennedy Jr., coming out and saying, what he wants to do to support psychedelic research. Joe Rogan's dropped a couple episodes fairly recently with Paul Stamets, another one fairly recently he did with Rick Doblin, when I say recently, over the past couple months or so anyway. And so there's been a lot of, talk, I think, recently in the psychedelic space. So I think it's a real good time to actually, chat with you. But just before we get started, maybe you can give the audience just a little bit of a brief background about yourself.
Yeah, for sure. It's been an interesting story for me, for sure. One day when I die, maybe they'll write a book about it. But I mean, I'll try to give you the Coles notes. I talk a lot, so cut me off anytime. But I didn't really know what I was doing in life till about 29, 30 years old. I was just sort of doing a bunch of different odds and ends jobs and working HVAC and stuff. And then at about 27, 28, I went to radio and television school at Seneca College after I'd already graduated from York University. And, most of my friends were becoming doctors, lawyers, you name it, businessmen, entrepreneurs. It was, and then there was like just me being an idiot playboy. Long story short, I landed a job on 102.1 The Edge. I had a very good run on that radio station, and we took it to really one of the highest ratings that anyone's ever seen in Canada in terms of radio between 18 and 34-year-old males. Great run, got out of it before that thing sank its own ship, and then took a show over to Sirius XM. I not only worked on Sirius XM, but I was one of the first, call it radio show hosts to actually own my own content, and I would put it up on podcasting. So I was like weirdly like the number one iTunes comedy guy in Canada for 2 years as a podcast. We had big numbers there. That show never got as much traction as I had hoped it would, but I had amazing access through the SiriusXM platform to big name guests. You mentioned Rogan. I didn't quite get to Rogan, even though I met him a few times. But, I probably gave Theo Vaughn one of his first interviews ever on SiriusXM. I would get guys like Kill Tony Hinchcliffe, Brian Redband, it's right-hand man, Brian Callen, Fighter and the Kid. So like a really good run in the comedian, sort of really top echelon comedian sector. And then, to be honest, and I think this is what's going to lead into this conversation, is like, I'm a pretty anxious dude. I've gotten a little bit better with age, or maybe I haven't. I just sort of maybe are coping with it a little bit better. But a lot of my guests that I was accessing through that Sirius XM show at the time, whether they were like, again, these big name comedians or a lot of like musicians or just, up and coming actors, anxiety and depression came up a lot with the creative types. And what also came up a lot was microdosing magic mushrooms. I tripped with my boys in college many times and, done those like kind of dumb ways to approach it without proper set and setting and without just more using it like a party drug. And then I started learning about its focus, its help with anxiety, its help with dealing with fame and pressure and all this stuff. Not that I had fame and pressure, but they did. And so I'm like, I'm going to dabble in this. And when I dabbled in it, Doc, it like honestly instantly changed my life. It was just this really calming feeling, a naturally occurring feeling. I know you're a big cannabis supporter, but cannabis never really gave me that. Cannabis gave me the giggles, and it was a very separate feeling that I've ever had. And long story short, I never make a long story short. I apologize, but I'd gotten to know during this time as well, while I was on Sirius XM, a lot of the cannabis companies and all the cryptocurrency companies, because I would bring them on my show as guests, a lot of these CEOs and stuff. And because of that, I learned a little bit about the capital markets. So what I ended up ultimately doing was saying, like, I found a new passion. The radio side of thing was sort of like just, I'd done it for about 20 years and it just wasn't in my heart and soul anymore. So I'm like, I'm going to try to raise some money here. And with this great concept of an idea to sell magic truffles, which are legal to do so in the Netherlands. And here we are 5 years later, a publicly traded company, having raised multiples of millions of dollars, making a big name for ourselves and the right to try and the access for psychedelics. And, we can get into it now, but that's really how I'm now in this sector and fighting the good fight of that sort of ethos of decentralization, deregulation, and personal sovereignty, and taking care of our financial and mental freedoms.
That's awesome. That's quite the transformation and quite the story. And you didn't make it too long. It was perfect. Everything you said in there, I think, needed to be said and was, really important part of the story. But maybe one of the parts that, people are probably most intrigued about is, you said that, you were a little bit anxious still, sometimes that may still come up, but you're dealing with it, significantly better these days. And you're saying that psilocybin or magic mushrooms, is part of the reason that you've been able to deal with it so much better and that it's kind of been, a game changer for you. You mentioned microdosing. So for you yourself, Todd, was it microdosing itself that was the game changer for you? Or was it more like one retreat or like a one big, macro dose session with like a therapist? Or what was the real big game changer for you?
So it was microdosing. In the Netherlands, we sell actually magic truffles, and that's the way to do it legally. And I went down there first to explore the product and understand it. And, I got to be careful, CEO of a publicly traded company. So I don't want to encourage anybody to get this stuff illegally. But trust me, we all know it's very, very accessible. The Canada Post, it's illegal in Canada, but Canada Post will ship it right to your door. But again, make sure, you abide by all the laws. And so the microdosing was really what helped me. And when it comes, and we can talk about that a little bit more, but when it comes to the hero dose, actually, it's really interesting. I'm very close with a trained facilitator, and I actually am going through different types of anxiety at this point. I've just started to open up about it, but it was since the COVID vaccines actually that I took 2 of them, and I haven't been the same ever since. And I'm dealing with a lot of my own personal trauma through that. And again, I don't want to get too polarizing here, and everyone has the right to, choose what to do with their body. And I did it in that reason because I had to travel as a CEO, but there were contraindications. So, there's a lot going on in my head about why did I make that decision? Should I have not done that? Should I have waited it out? But you got to live with it. And I have a facilitator friend who really wants me to help deal with my own trauma by going deep into sort of this therapeutic session and help deal with that ego death, they call it, and my fear of death because of it. So really interesting so that you asked that, but it is something I plan to do responsibly and through a proper facilitator model and call it and probably within the coming year.
Okay, so with their microdosing, there's so many different protocols out there. Paul Stamets has one of the more famous ones where he says, I think it's usually about 100 to 200 micrograms 5 days a week. And he usually says to take that with lion's mane and with niacin. He calls it the NLP protocol. James Fadiman, another fairly famous one. He says, I think it's 0.3 to 0.5 twice per week or every third day, something like that. You may know better than I do. Which protocol did you pick, and why do you think that the protocol you selected was effective for you?
Yeah. So we've actually published some protocols on microdosing at redlight.co. You'll be able to find that. And that's with sort of our neuroscientist on staff. But I have to be honest, I'm kind of like a fly by the seat of my own pants kind of guy. And that may or may not be good, and especially in the medical field, Doc. But I will go and typically use magic truffles just at the moment that I think is appropriate. So I'm not sticking to a strict schedule or a strict protocol. Typically, I like to make sure I'll do it in the morning. And the reason for that is with my overactive mind, the last thing I want to do is not shut it down because it actually opens it up very positively. And I want to stay in those places. So I'll do it in the morning with a breakfast. And I typically will just sort of, to be honest, eat a little bit 3 or 4 times a week. And I don't measure it. I'm not necessarily weighing it. And that's the way, just for clarity, that's how you have to do it. And in those cases where you have pill forms that are hopefully standardized, because we're still not sure what you're getting in from most of these illegal shops, but whether they're 100 milligram or 200 milligram, it's hard to determine the psilocin or psilocybin content within those pills. So I would say go low, start slow, or whatever they say, start low, go slow, whatever that expression is. So you use what you feel is great. And then I love it. And this is the phrase that I like to say. I love it when I'm at a point where I'm, everyone has their cell phone, where what I call is like the bendy phone phase. And the bendy phone phase is where like the true psychedelics aren't kicking in, but nothing, you're not feeling nothing either, but your phone just feels a little bit curved. The numbers just pop out you a little bit more. And then you're kind of like in this, your own little matrix, your own little great spot. And that's when I find that my body is letting go of some of those bricks that I put in, and being a publicly traded CEO and past public life and was current public life, I guess, and two small kids in this world. Like, it is constant pressure. When I can sort of slowly let that guard down and just be more in touch with those around me, nature, things like this, I find that's when I'm really at my best. And by the way, it helps the golf game.
Oh, well, bonus for people who play golf. I actually haven't gotten into golf yet. Maybe I will one day. But just coming back again to your approach overall there, Todd. So basically you're just doing it, as you feel like you need to. So, when, things are dipping down a little bit, or when you need a little bit more energy or just a quick reset, that's when you kind of get into the mushrooms. And, I know because of that approach, you don't have, a certain amount that you're doing it maybe per week or per month, but like, what would that roughly average out to? And again, I know, you're not, typically into, measuring your doses, but roughly like how much do you think you would do in one dose per se, or does it vary?
Yeah. And for me, I would probably, in fact, I would use it more if it were legal. So for example, I'm just extra cautious, CEO of a publicly traded company. We deal with the FDA and DEA with shipments from the Netherlands to the United States. So for me to answer that question, it's difficult, because I think if I had better access, or even if I wasn't a publicly traded company CEO, I'd probably be using it a lot more. I would just walk into one of these illegal shroomy shops and buy it for myself. But I'm just extra paranoid, to be honest, and extra cautious. So typically I don't use this stuff unless I'm in the Netherlands, or maybe, I'm at a campfire, some friends have some, I'll probably dabble at that point, but I'm extra careful. So my point being is, I think I would like to use it more. And this is what the message I'm trying to get out there. And hopefully our governments are listening, and consumer demand is proving that people want to use it more. And people are using it more, especially with alcohol declining and people taking care of their mental health better, and science backing it, and anecdotal stories completely backing it. So it's my way of dancing around the fact that I got to be extra careful. But microdosing, today, for example, I'm pretty anxious. Doing the show with you, didn't have a great night's sleep, got a lot going on with the company. If I had it in front of me, I would absolutely have taken one this morning.
Okay, got you. And just a real quick question on the legality of it, because you mentioned something there that's kind of interesting. Like, I've seen at least one or two shops, in London, Ontario. That's where I am. They're just right out in the open, like a magic mushroom shop, just like you would see like a gas station kind of thing, or a convenience store. How is that legal in Canada right now? And why aren't these places getting shut down?
Yeah, it's very frustrating. Do people call you Mike or Dr. Hart? Like, what do I call you? Can I just call you Doc?
You can call me whatever you want.
No, like when you're a doctor, I never know. Like, you always have to put the doctor before the name, or can you call the doctor by the first name?
No, definitely not. Just no. It's kind of weird when people reference me as doctor throughout the whole conversation. So
yeah, I know.
Just Mike's perfectly fine, Todd. We're all good.
Thanks, Mike. Because I just, when I do these things, I normally like just to say the first name. But Mike, it's become very frustrating for a company like ours, who pays copious amounts of money in legal opinions, in listing fees, in quality control and R&D, to do it properly, to be self-regulatory, to have great corporate governance. And then you just see these shops popping up everywhere across Canada. So on one level, I love it, because again, it is allowing me to go to my board of directors, go to my shareholders, go to everybody to say, hey, look, there is a market. Consumer demand is there, and it is not going away anytime soon. But then when you look at the regulatory process and the lack of crackdowns, it becomes very frustrating. So we like to say that we're the outliers and they're the outlaws. And should outlaws be able to exist to disrupt industry? They shouldn't. Imagine if someone just started making alcohol in their bathtubs and selling it. Well, I can tell you what, the big companies would not appreciate that. It would make sure it was shut down. So this is something I would say that the Canadian government hasn't ever really figured out with cannabis either, with the oversaturation and still the illegal, gray market. And it is a bit of a fear within the magic mushroom business. So the law is, it is still illegal to consume. In some areas there is decrim, meaning if you're caught with it, they're not going to care. But in terms of mass production, that is illegal. And what we're hoping for is expansion on this Exemption 56 or the Special Access Program, which is giving people this right to try through proper legal measures, and then hopefully wider access for those with their own trauma. So, but right now it's aggravating because they're walking away with tons of cash. Consumers don't necessarily know what they're getting. Are they getting proper education and information around it? We're not quite sure. And we want to be the company that sort of mitigates all of that risk and make sure you're getting great product.
Yeah, I mean, as a physician, obviously I think people should be, doing it in a dose-controlled manner. I think they should know exactly what they're getting. So, in many ways, is like a libertarian sort of kind of view. I like that people, should be able to have access to it, but I also think that people, should also know what they're getting, and I think they would get significantly, better results that way. And I think that if they want to do it through a clinic, through a physician, that should be something that they should be able to have access to. And maybe we can chat a little bit about that. So Section 56 and the Special Access Program. So these are basically, the two ways that people are able to use medicinal mushrooms legally in Canada. So how successful are those two programs, and how difficult is it to access medicinal mushrooms through those two methods?
It's definitely still very, very difficult. We're not a company right now that are getting patients and applying for them. There's great companies out there and some big advocacy work being done. But and they have allowed it for some with terminal illness, to cope with sort of this sadly next chapter of life where they will be on their decline up and towards death, and from severe trauma. But we believe, especially with this mental health crisis going on right now, that they need to open up that channels a lot more clearer. And I don't know why they're taking their time so much, especially with all the data now. Great data points, and there's just a ton of access, a ton of anecdotal stories out there, combined with the illegal access that people are getting, to be able to show like the contraindications are very low. We're obviously clearly learning about the fact that there's no addictive qualities towards psilocybin. If anything, it's helping people wean off things like opioids and benzos. The benefits are there. So we're trying to advocate very hard with the government. If anything, we actually think maybe the conservative government is leaning a little bit more towards getting access, especially with veterans and first emergency responders, much like we said regarding the administration over in the United States with Casey Means, the Surgeon General, with Doug Collins, who's the Secretary of Veteran Affairs, with RFK Jr. I mean, they really are looking to disrupt that system and providing access sooner rather than later, because they want to stop the close to 25 deaths, suicides a week from veterans in America. And they want something else to happen. And if we wait forever, are we just going to, continue to allow, unfortunately, trauma to take over? So it's a really interesting time, Doc. And, I got to be honest, I give people like you such credit because you put yourself out there, medical professional, going up, with a medical board, you talk about psychedelics openly, you talk about cannabis openly. Like what kind of pushback do you see in your call it academia conversations? Because you're taking a bold step, and we admire that in people like yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I've taken, I think some hits over the years. I started with cannabis, back in like 2014, 2015. And again, I'm not someone who is, a big fan of using high THC at all. I think that, for short periods, it can be good for some people. And maybe for others, if they're using it with CBD, and they use it at moderate doses, it can be effective. But, like you kind of mentioned, earlier, like you said, it didn't really work for yourself. And I think there's other people that, it doesn't work for either. And sometimes can even make things even worse, especially if you're, predisposed to psychosis and that kind of thing. With the psilocybin, it seems to be like there's a little bit more of a methodical approach to it, just because it's something that's not being inhaled. When something's inhaled, obviously there's, a stigma to it, and rightfully so in many ways, because even with vaping, it's been shown that it can increase hypertension or high blood pressure. It is going to damage your lungs. Smoking, we know, cannabis does have some, ill effects as well. It's not nearly as bad as smoking cigarettes. With the medicinal mushrooms, you can get it obviously in capsules. And like you said, it is difficult to standardize, but I do think that, that process is coming and it will become better and better. And there are, quite a few randomized control trials on it. And, I think there's probably even more randomized control trials on, don't quote me on this, on psilocybin, that there may be even on THC and cannabis, even though there are, quite a few studies on THC and CBD. A lot of them are more observational studies and case studies and that kind of thing. But, there are like meta-analysis of randomized control trials on psilocybin. Like there was one recently that involved over 427 people. And so hopefully by presenting it that way, I won't get as much flack or, take as many hits maybe as I did when I was talking about cannabis. And, I do think that right now we are behind, Canada is on, getting patients access to this medicine. And that's something too that I wanted to chat with you about, because you had a really interesting clip, and I, mentioned this recently actually on a post and shared it on Instagram and Twitter, and how right now it's actually easier to get access to euthanasia or medically assisted induced death than it is to medicinal mushrooms or psilocybin. So like, why do you think that is? And what are your thoughts on that?
I'm always careful because I need to work with whatever government's in power.
Right.
And we genuinely want to work with the governments. We want to be able to show the data we've collected from the Netherlands about how psilocybin is working. And we want to be able to have other means of support for those with trauma before a medically assisted suicide decision. And, I want to say this as carefully with as big of a heart as possible on the Heart to Heart podcast, is that we get why decisions are made. And as I've said in past clips, we understand if there's terminal illness or if there's Parkinson's or we get why people choose medically assisted suicide, and what a difficult decision that must be for those people who are choosing to do it and their families, and in their families in some case, who are having to watch this happen. So when it comes to trauma though, and mental health, if we now are seeing science backing up change and backing up support and doing all the science that it does, which you could speak to much more clearly than I can, but why isn't the government then saying, hey, let's get access to magic mushrooms. Let's use that as a last resort. Then if the person with trauma hasn't seen that work as a treatment-resistant issue, which they're obviously already gone down the list of all the SSRIs and everything else that's probably been prescribed through therapy and pills, well, then maybe we could say, okay, let them make that choice. But I think our governments would be amazed to see the data and to see what that would happen. Like, what a great phase one that would be alone. Those who were choosing medically assisted suicide because of trauma, give them that first option of magic mushrooms, and then let's weigh that data and see if they then said, you know what? I actually think that's not the route for me anymore. I'm feeling more comfortable in my own skin. A lot of work to do, clearly, if you got into that point. Again, I'm not a medical professional, but it just seems to me like it should be like another option. And you asked the question, why don't we think they've done it? I think it's the stigma. I think the stigma of what we've done over the 100 years, which it took so long to do for cannabis, and it's still taking a little bit longer than we'd like to think it would take for magic mushrooms, of criminalizing nature, which is one of the most ridiculous fucking stigmas on the planet. This is God-given stuff. And I don't care what God you believe in, but the fact that we can't have a right to try something that is from the planet, it's asinine. So I hope that stigma goes away. Advocacy works, and there's amazing advocacy groups all across the United States, all across Canada. I don't think those breaking the law and selling it at pop-up shops and street corners and this and that, I don't think that's going to do us any favors in the long run. But hopefully companies like ours and a slew of great companies, it's not just about us within the sector, and big voices such as yourself, I think we just got to keep hoping those dominoes fall to be able to get that right to try.
Yeah, I agree with you. And, just one thing too on the MAID, or the euthanasia, I'm in agreement with that policy when people, have terminal illnesses. Like if you're in severe pain, you have ALS, that you're going to die and, essentially there's nothing left for you. I understand someone wanting to pull the plug, access euthanasia. But for people who are, severely depressed, who have gone through, a lot of trauma in their life, and they're, at the end of their life and they just need something to maybe, make their quality of life better. And, just to deny them access to medicinal mushrooms, I think is terrible. I think that, we're not doing those people a service at all. And that, just by offering them euthanasia instead of medicinal mushrooms is not appropriate at all. And again, I'm talking about the people who are, dealing with a lot of mental health, dealing with end of life crisis and palliative care, that kind of thing. These are the people I think that should have, access to medicinal mushrooms before the euthanasia. And then of course, obviously I think that, the regular everyday person who, is not near the end of their life and, is just dealing with depression or anxiety, has treatment resistant depression, PTSD, or whatever mental health issue that they should also have, access to medicinal mushrooms as well. But, certainly, coming back to the people who are offered euthanasia for, trauma, I think that they should be offered the medicinal mushrooms in addition to the euthanasia, and should be offered the medicinal mushrooms first.
Absolutely. We're very aligned in that. So what would your thoughts be like when you saw the kind of cannabis breakdowns and that happen? I mean, do you have any optimism when it comes to psilocybin? Can you be vocal with this stuff? Do you have advocacy groups that you work with, the Therapeutic guys? What is it that actual trained doctors and practitioners are starting to do to see if there can be change?
Well, I think right now, most people want more access for their patients. So, as a physician, the most powerful thing that I can do really is to get it into the hands of a patient and to prescribe to them so that they actually get the therapeutic effects, and so that they can get better. And so right now, obviously, as we mentioned through, Section 56, the special access program, that makes it, extremely challenging. Right. So all we can really do, I think, at this point is try to group together, put together the best science that we can, get experts, whether it's someone like, Rick Doblin or a Paul Stamets, who has, done a lot of research out in the field and, has helped people with these particular medicines, get them speaking more, get more studies done. Certainly the big thing that was, the knock against cannabis, and still is to some degree. And the knock against, you could say, every single alternative medicine to some degree, is lack of randomized controlled trials. That's what people want to see. That's what the FDA and the CDC wants to see. They want to see randomized controlled trials. They want to see that this drug is, I hate to say these words, is safe and effective, but that's what people are really looking for. That's what the FDA and the CDC wants to see. And so I think that as physicians, the only thing we can do right now is really try to advocate for more randomized controlled trials. And then I think once you have so many randomized controlled trials, it kind of becomes undeniable to a certain degree. Like I said, there was a meta-analysis recently with 427 people of randomized controlled trials, which is a pretty decent number. Anything in the 200 to 300 range is considered to be pretty significant evidence. And they're all showing the same thing over and over. And then the other thing too is, we understand the mechanism of action of this. It does act on the 5-HT2A receptor, which is, quite different than, say, SSRIs, which act on different serotonin receptors. And And, on that note too, it's kind of interesting, when you talk about like, psychosis, and for people who don't understand, like, drugs like Seroquel or quetiapine, like those kind of drugs that are very sedating. Some people use them for sleep, off label, which, I don't necessarily always agree with, but, if it works, that's fantastic. But those drugs block the 5-HT2A receptor, so they're blocking that sort of psychosis response. Whereas when you're taking psilocybin, it's an agonist of the 5-HT2A receptor, so you're getting more of that receptor activated. So it does the exact opposite, and so that's why for some people, when they're taking certain medicines like quetiapine, like Seroquel, if you're going to be using psilocybin, is essentially isn't going to work because that receptor is being blocked by another medicine. And so it's important for people to understand that and to make sure that they, do chat with someone if they're on, various different medicines before they, access a drug like this. And then the other part of that too is that for sure, I understand that all drugs have risks and benefit. There's, good doses and bad doses of various different drugs. Like, I'm also a big fan of, testosterone replacement therapy. But obviously, if you take too much of that, that can have very detrimental effects as well. I don't think it necessarily caused Hulk Hogan's death in certain ways, but like if you look at videos of him when he's like 34 years old, it is crazy how old he looks. So like, the excessive androgens that you can get from TRT or testosterone replacement therapy are, definitely something that you need to be concerned about. But if you get a good therapeutic dose, your sexual drive comes back, your brain's turned on, particularly when you get a conversion to DHT or dihydrotestosterone. And then when you're coming in back and talking about, psilocybin, I think that we just need to make sure that we get people taking the right doses overall. And that's sort of a responsibility, I think, on us and on the medical community to make sure that we do, get the right randomized control trials, and we do see what's good for certain groups of people and what's not good for certain groups of people. And, one thing that unfortunately I think, is a little bit of a disservice right now with some of these, magic mushroom shops. And again, I think people should be able to do whatever they want. But my, real big fear and concern here is that it could set us back a bit, because I could easily see people going into these shops who, don't need these medicinal mushrooms and perhaps have some certain contraindications to them. They may be on certain medicines that are going to affect them differently. And then they're going to have these psychotic outbreaks. There's going to be an increase potentially in like ER visits. And then all of a sudden, in the media, it's just going to be like medicinal mushrooms are, causing psychosis, and it's a negative drug. Why were we even looking at this medicinally? And so I am afraid that that's going to happen. And so I'm glad that there are, companies like yourself, that are trying to get this, regulated and, in specified doses, working with scientists, doctors, and various different people, because my fear is that these shops could end up doing a bit of a disservice to us because they're going to get the wrong doses and the wrong people in the wrong hands. And it's going to induce some psychosis and some awful effects in certain people.
Yeah. And it doesn't sound, but it seems like they're almost just like waiting for that, like to publish the news story. Whenever there is like that one case, it seems to go viral. And you're right. And in the Netherlands, where we can sell legally our magic truffles with psilocybin, what we're most proud of is how we sell it. So we clearly label contraindications on a pamphlet inside, much like you'd be buying over-the-counter Tylenol. We have a little barcode on it that you can scan, get you to our app, which can then set up an appointment with a telecounselor. So you can, if there's ever an issue, you can walk yourself through it, or you can time your microdosing with the telecounselor to have basically a live therapy session. We really don't want to sell it like fireworks, as I joke, which most people do in the Netherlands. They really haven't put much thought into it. And they're flashy, they're this, they're that. We're very careful, especially if you're, bipolar disorder. We make sure, that's clearly labeled. Don't do it if you're pregnant, like really basic stuff, actually. But that is the self-regulatory measures that we're doing. We also have developed an app that within that same barcode, or what is it, barcode or not barcode, the QR code. The QR code will then put you to a privacy first. So you have to like agree to do it. It's consensual, private data. And then we put that data into now about 1,000, north of 1,000 people. That's actually been studied by and analyzed by Professor David Nutt at the UK Drug Science. And we're learning about, certain ethnicities that use it, certain, men, women, how it's affecting them, time of day, the weight versus what you're using. So we've really, learned a ton about our product, including people's individual protocols, which helped develop the protocol that we now suggest today carefully in the Netherlands. And I think what we're most proud of recently, and I'm sure you'd love this, is we just brought on one of the, I think the Tom Brady of psychedelics as an advisor to the company, named Dr. Robin Carhart Harris. And
I'd agree with that. He's awesome.
He's incredible. And, not just, he always comes from a very open, humble approach. But I mean, this individual has studied psychedelics between LSD, MDMA, psychedelics, psilocybin, more than most at this point. So we're starting to see great advisors within the company based on the data and the responsible use aspect of us selling it through information and education. And these are the stuff we want to eventually share, hopefully with the governments in the United States and the governments in Canada, which, by the way, we successfully did in Oregon, because we presented to the Senate in Oregon on their bill that they passed, and they put microdosing in their bill because of our company. So we're getting ourselves out there, and data is everything in your world, especially when you're prescribing. So what's the next model? And that's what I want to ask you. Where do you, if you could sort of put on this vision, board and a hat in 5 years, Doctor, where do you see access to psilocybin, and how do you see it being basically distributed?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. I think there's 3 different ways that psilocybin is basically being administered right now. One way would be microdosing, which we, talked about a little bit, various different protocols. And I think, there may not be a consensus on the very best protocol, just for, I'm not saying that there aren't significant issues with psychiatric drugs or antidepressants or, ADHD drugs, but just like there's not one, standard dose that works for people, say, on antidepressants or on stimulant drugs like Vyvanse and that kind of thing. There may not be a standard microdose. There may be a starting microdose, but some people need to ramp that up. So I think we need to figure out that. That's kind of one part. The second part, is you can do this with macrodosing. And so, maybe we should define macrodosing a little bit, but I don't think we've really done that. So, it really varies in the literature. Some people will say, 2.5 to 3.5 grams is, a macrodose, whereas some people will say that, over 5 grams, which, Dr. Terence McKenna dubbed as a heroic dose, or crossing over to the other side is. And many people who I know, have said that, always just take 6 just to kind of be safe, to make sure that you do kind of get to the other side, so to speak. So I think we need to look at macrodosing as well, and also understand that when you're doing the macrodosing, that's really when you need to be under the care of a qualified therapist. And, these different studies that, MAPS are doing, with Rick Doblin, and also, too, you mentioned Robin Carhart Harris. I think there was one time he mentioned there was quite a bit of difference in doing these sessions when you have a mask on versus not a mask on, having background music versus not having background music. So, teasing that out and trying to find the best protocol. So that would be kind of number 2. So, we kind of discussed 2 ways now. And then the third way, which is kind of interesting, which, overlaps, I think, with macrodosing, would be these retreats, and I think the thing with the retreats that makes it different than a macrodose is that when you're doing the macrodose, you have a session, and then maybe you have a session even before you do the macrodose session where you're talking about integration. And so integration would be, how do you actually, take this experience and influence it in your life so that you draw, what you want from the experience, and you're actually making some changes overall. So with the macrodosing with a therapist, it's often done, maybe a week apart, maybe 2 weeks apart, 3 weeks apart, whatever the overall protocol is, with the retreats, whether it's 3 days, sometimes it may be a little bit longer. It seems like there's integration almost immediately. Like, you do your session that day, there's integration that night, maybe the next morning, maybe the next day. And there could be, very long integration sessions, like several hours. And I think with the retreats too, I can't speak for all retreats, but there's a little more emphasis perhaps on other things outside of just the medicine itself. They may talk about relationships or nutrition or exercise or other things that can like support overall mental health. And so, I would like to see all three of those things being, offered to people, and I think that people would, appreciate those three different offerings, because some people, they may want to try medicinal mushrooms, but they don't want that sort of high where they are breaking through to the other side for whatever reason, and that's within their right. If they just want to like a light microdose where they're getting a little bit of a change, but they're still with it, they're still in control, I think that's could potentially be extremely therapeutic. Although I think there's probably more evidence for macrodosing right now, but still we'll see what happens with that. With the macrodosing in the clinic setting, some people just feel more comfortable going to someone who, quote unquote, looks like a doctor kind of thing, goes into a physician's office that looks just like a regular-ish physician's office or a psychotherapist's office, that kind of thing. That's where they feel most comfortable. They're okay with, breaking through to the other side. That's fantastic. And then there's some people who, they're more into holistic medicine, maybe alternative medicine in general. They just like being out in nature. They find nature to be healing. And for those people, they may want to go to retreats. And I think that all three of those should be available to people. So I'm hoping that we can do, trials on all of them. I don't see why, we can't. I think, as you said, there's been some done with microdosing, some done with macrodosing as well. With the retreats, I know there was one that was just very recently published on veterans. And so we probably need a little more research on that one. That's probably the one that's lagging the most behind. But I think that, all three of them have serious clinical value. And, that's where I see it going in the next, 5 years. I mean, that's sort of a hope that it gets to all three of those levels. But I would like to see all three of those different types of treatments offered to people, over the next 5 years or, sooner if we can.
Yeah, well said. And the interesting thing about those three models are that is really exactly how we see it playing out. And some states have already done that facilitator model for the macrodose. There's definitely clinics out there that allow it. It's legal in Oregon and I believe now some in Colorado. They're exploring other different areas. And it's a typical states that break down from cannabis first, and then eventually it opens up to hopefully the world. We're seeing the Czech Republic make some big advancements. We're seeing both New Zealand and Australia talking about these named patient models where you name a patient, you have their ailment, and then a doctor prescribes some naturally occurring products. So they're not just synthetics at this point. So there's some great advancements happening within the world. And then the retreat style stuff for sure. I think everyone's seen, heard of Aaron Rodgers doing the ayahuasca, or like certain celebrities doing, Mike Tyson talks about this stuff. The one interesting thing that I think should be a little bit different, and I wonder how it will play out or roll out, is when it comes to that everyday access, like that microdosing access. I see it different than, we're both in Canada and specifically in Ontario where there's the OCS stores. I see it playing out differently than just storefronts. I actually see it, and what I'd love to advocate for, as a publicly traded company, we'd actually love to advocate for storefronts. Everyone just go in and buy it and make a ton of money. But we understand that the responsible use angle has to always exist. And we're kind of pushing for this interesting combined model of, if you think about getting a coffee in the morning, you typically have your favorite coffee shop. Most people go 4 or 5 times a week, at least 2 or 3, and they're in that routine to get their coffee. And so we almost see it like you go and pick up your microdosing pill for the day. So you're not leaving with a pack of 12, and then all of a sudden you could take 12 or hand some out to your friends. So it might be a bit inconvenient for some if we were to ever get to that model. But on the microdosing side, if you're not having a trained facilitator or being in a room with a doctor at a retreat with a group of people and a bunch of different facilitators monitoring everything that's going on, we think that that's an interesting model and something the government should consider. And again, it puts a lot of thought into it. You're not just getting it in copious amounts and exploiting that kind of use. So maybe inconvenient, like I said, but if you had enough of them and they were close enough in your area and you knew it was helping you, that might be an interesting approach. I will say, with that being said, maybe we should have trust more in human beings and doctors, because any pill you have at home, you could overdose in or you could give to your friends. And I don't care what SSRI you have or a bottle of Advil. Like if you're taking too many, it's not gonna do well for you. So it's again, maybe I'm adding to the stigma by that facilitator type model or getting it like a cup of coffee, but at least it mitigates risk. And because of that huge stigma we've had for all these years now, with the big war against drugs, we're doing everything we can to at least get it out there that's palatable for regulatory officials. And that's just one of those other solution-based models that we will present and have presented in the past.
One question I want to ask you. So psilocybin, ayahuasca, MDMA, why do you think psilocybin stands out most? If you could only pick one, like, why do you think that psilocybin is the one that stands out?
Yeah. And candidly, I'm not the expert on all these different types of psychoactive drugs. I don't even like saying drugs. But for me, the most clear anecdotal model of consistency in terms of it working for people's mental health, focus, anxiety has got to be psilocybin. So if I were to take like this, if I were to go on and figure out ways to collect all the data that you see from Instagram and Twitter and public Facebook posts and mums for microdosing and all these things, we're seeing such positive benefits. And when it comes to like the MDMAs and when it comes to ayahuascas and these other ones, it's not to say that I don't think there's some great advancements that's going on specifically with MDMA and some of the bigger drug discovery companies, but those are still deemed as like really deep, dark sessions at times, especially ayahuasca. I mean, you got to be really trained very, very well to be able to come and cope with what is going to happen to some of those patients within you. And in some cases, it doesn't work. When it comes to psilocybin, I'm not a medical practitioner, like I said, so I can't give medical advice. But what I will say is, again, read up or just ask your friends, because everybody seems to be very open about this stuff. We're seeing way less risk and a lot of work being done, a lot of really positive work being done for people's trauma. So that was sort of why I went into this field. The other reason why I went in this field is I just liked it. It worked for me. So I've never done ayahuasca. Yes, I've partied with MDMA in the past. Yes, I'm saying that openly and candidly. Yes, I had a great time, transformational moments with that as well. I did have that serotonin depletion over the next couple of days where I felt like, very, very kind of down and depressed, but also walked my way through it and just knowing that it was a temporary moment in time. But in terms of mass access, we felt that psilocybin was the best approach. And then on terms of a revenue-based model where we were allowed to commercialize it immediately in the Netherlands, which we've done. So we've built up a couple of different brands called World of Maca. We built up another brand called iMicrodose. We have a distribution company that sells it, again, responsibly to over 200 different shops across the Netherlands. So, and this is where we've then since collected data from. We've had no reports of any injury, any problems, anything at all. And we can monitor that stuff very easily. So it sort of fit the model too, selfishly, to be able to like go into the public markets and try to increase revenues year after year, which we've proven to do as well. And most importantly, have that as our guinea pig sample in the small country of 17, 18 million people, to be able to then say, hey, this is how we should do it in a country of 40 million people or a country of 400 million people.
Are you ever worried about psychedelics becoming too corporate?
I don't worry about that stuff. Like, I mean, call me a capitalist at the end of the day. I think that if capitalism helps mental health, like, why are we weighing that or worried about that? If there are true, really wonderfully authentic, genuine companies that want to help, and yes, will profit matter? As if we are publicly traded, yes, profit matters. But if it means we're fighting the good fight, we're getting regulatory bodies to sort of rush or expedite their nature, because maybe they would have gone slower. And if there is, at the end of the day, a solution for human beings to help with all this trauma, can you blame people for making money off of that? Maybe this sounds totally greedy and corporate of me. I don't think you can, because ultimately you're I wish people saw the behind the scenes of what I have to go through as a small cap company of about 20 million-ish. I can't even imagine the big drug discovery companies. So as long as the science is there, the data is there, and the genuine approach is there to help people, I don't think anybody should be upset. With that being said, things should be affordable. Access should be able to be given. I don't think you should be able to, milk consumers or those in need for prices. We've seen this big scientific kind of interesting time over the last couple of years where we've seen corporate greed truly happen in a lot of the big pharma models, where they're charging crazy amounts of money, especially in the United States, for drugs that it's like something like 300 to 900% higher than they're doing it in Europe. And again, love or hate this guy Trump, but he's trying to crack down on that price and using leverage against European, the American companies.
I saw that recently. I even posted about it. It's quite, that is quite a feat. I think Dr. Marty McCary was one of the lead guys behind that. He was actually on the podcast before Dr. McCary was. But yeah, I mean, it's outstanding how much they pay for their drugs in the United States, and the fact that Trump and McCary are trying to, eliminate that or reduce it is fantastic. So, there's no way you can hate on, the administration for that move.
I hope people don't hate on the administration for things that are actually working. I mean, I get it. There's polarizing views, but at some point, access to psychedelics for me is number one. Lowering drug costs is got to be a huge one. Helping healthcare, helping people get access to the drugs that they need at more affordable prices. So, there is some good being done, and anyone could call RFK Jr. a quack or this or an anti-vaxxer or a conspiracy theorist, all these kind of things. But there needs to be a voice of reason, and when I say that it's not always just science-backed data, because there was also another study that came out the other day to talk about all the fraud in science. And all the fact where people are raising money and they're pushing data that isn't necessarily always accurate, and they're just getting their funding to push things through, basically because they're trying to protect their own livelihood. So yes, there's great doctors out there. I don't want to distrust everyone, and nobody falls under the same blanket ever. There's a lot of us, and we should not be stereotyping any one side or any one person or any one sector. But what we need to be is very open in our thoughts and go dig deep into research, dig deep into, it's hard actually to find the truth these days between AI and polarizing views. Like, it's almost creating crazy trauma in everybody because no one knows what to believe. But my point being is there's got to be other options. And a guy like RFK Jr. is at least discussing optionality. And I think optionality leaves everybody's brains wide open and to saying, okay, maybe there's more. Maybe I should have questioned this better. And by the way, if I explore it and don't agree, well, now I'm going to prove and debate you on why I don't like what you're saying. So let me just put out my position. And then again, what it comes down to, and this is what we're the biggest believers in, and this is our entire ethos, as I said at the beginning, is personal sovereignty. What is right for us, as long as it doesn't put harm to others? And we should be able to think more that way. And this government controlled stuff can be quite scary. So I hope more human beings can start really, especially as you get older. Like I'm 52 now. How old are you?
I'm 40.
Mike?
You don't look 52.
You're 40. Thanks, dude. Well, I'm starting to recede a little bit. That's why I wear the hat all the time. But I'm 50. Listen, I try to work out. I try to stay in good shape. I try to eat healthy. And I think anxiety is sometimes the best youth drug because it keeps you moving, keeps you thin. But again, as you get older, you really question things more. And people, most importantly, and magic mushrooms helps you with this, by the way. most importantly, should be able to question and should be able to be independent and not indoctrinated. We should be able to push the boundaries a bit. We're human beings, for fuck's sakes. Like, don't just take everything that is told to you with a grain of salt. Question it and be able to make your own choices. And if you lose friends because of it, or if you lose family members because of it, as long as you're comfortable in your own skin, you're going to find a group that loves you and supports you, and that's okay. So I think this world is really scary right now because everyone wants to shit on everyone for being a little bit alternative. And I just like to think of it as not alternative, but optionality. And that should be a good thing.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, overall RFK Jr. and what the administration is doing is fantastic. And I think they did a really good job with hiring Dr. Martin Makary and Dr. Jay Bhattacharya. I think those guys are very level-headed. I don't think that they're, outlandish at all. I think they're making really good decisions. I think everything that they're doing is very evidence-based, and, like questioning, giving antidepressants to pregnant women, it's just a question. Let's just see what happens and what comes out of this evidence. Some people say, like, the evidence is settled on that. Well, we do know that there are some at risk, at least, like with like paroxetine, there's some cardiac risk. I forget the exact, heart malformation that's increased that risk with. But, there's some things I think that, need to be questioned that are just have been closed off. And, that's not right. We should be able to question things. And I think that after the 4 years, again, they've only been in administration, I think, for 6 or 7 months. After the 4 years, I think, we will see, some pretty significant changes, and hopefully whoever gets in after, continues to make those changes. And so, I'm pretty excited for what they're doing, even though I was, a little bit critical of him, calling the, putting sugar cane instead of the high glucose fructose syrup, a win. I thought, okay, it's really just still sugar. But, overall, when you look at his policies and what he's doing, I think that there's going to be a significant net benefit. And that's really, what we're going for, not just, evaluate someone just based upon one thing that they said, evaluate the person based upon their whole career and everything that they're doing overall. Like, is this person, a net positive, or is this person, a net negative? And I think that overall, RFK Jr. and his administration is going to be a significant net positive for health and for the Americans in general. One question I had for you about, psychedelics is, like, which country do you think now is really leading the charge, and which country do you think is first going to have psychedelics as a standard of care?
Well, America is doing a pretty good job, surprisingly. And I think a lot of that is this new administration and the fact that they really do want to help veterans, as I said earlier. So we're seeing a really good charge in America in terms of a grand scale. On the, in certain states, again, have adapted that. And again, conservative senators, conservative leaders, that may surprise people, right? That, you always think sort of the liberal or the libertarian or that more democratic view is that right to try. They're more thinking about like decriminalization, where that's a weird model too, because you're not really writing regulatory bodies around it. You're just sort of allowing people who use illegal drugs to get away with it. That's really what deregulation means. So we're also seeing, I said, some great advancements now in the Czech Republic, where, I think war-torn countries, like, will they open up and have thoughts to use these? Maybe this is an issue with the first world problem stuff, but like, I don't know where anxiety comes from necessarily, but sometimes our anxiety is not even worthy of what real person's anxiety and trauma is. Hearing bombs being dropped down, or being, seeing families get kidnapped, or like, the world's a really, really bad place. And it seems off kilter ever since COVID. Nothing seems normal anymore. And my point being is, like, we're hoping that a lot of countries who are talking about this stuff, again, not that they're necessarily war torn, but like, New Zealand, Australia, we're seeing some advancements. So it is coming. We're seeing more and more talk. It's not stopping, which is the good news. But America ultimately will lead the charge.
Awesome. Well, Todd, I think our hour is just about up there now, but, please tell people where they can follow you on Twitter, anything else that you're doing, a little bit more about your company, and anything else you want to drop.
Yeah, and I could do this all day long. By the way, I'm like, I love this stuff. I just love how progressive you are and how open you are, and also like talking to doctors is really important for people like me because I can convey a good message and I can do it on a very human and emotional level. And yes, we have data from our company, and typically I'll bring our CTIO, and she's technically our CSO too, Chief Scientific Officer, but she can you guys would have a fascinating talk because you could go really deep into like how psychedelics are working and how it's connecting to, like you say, the 5-HT2A receptors, and how it's breaking down your priors and bringing you back to like a childlike substance. So you that would be another fascinating conversation. This lady Sarah Hashkis on our staff, but. Man, you're awesome. And regarding me, you can find me pretty easily on Twitter. Again, I used to be a voice in radio, so I hope people don't use that as sort of a stigma in terms of what I'm doing now. It's been 5 years being publicly traded, but it's at Todd M. Shapiro. Our company is at Red Light Holland, redlight.co.co, as you see. We have a great brand called Happy Caps. We sell regular mushrooms too. We sell lion's mane, oyster, shiitake. We most recently had a really big run in Costco's all across Canada, so we have very legitimate products. We also just launched at happycaps.ca or happycapsusa.com or on Amazon a functional mushroom gummy that has a NPN, that's a Health Canada approved natural health number for its lion's mane shiitake gummy that is proven out through the science to help with immune boosting and to help with antioxidants. So maybe that's why I don't look 52. No, just talking to this stuff. We're really proud. And again, what we're trying to do is put out products today that one day could be psilocybin based, a psilocybin gummy, a home grow psilocybin fungi in your home, as opposed to just lion's mane shiitake or oyster mushrooms. So we're really trying to think about where we are 5-10 years from now. And I'll leave you with one last polarizing statement. I'm a father of a 10 and soon to be 6-year-old. And I swear there's a lot of over medication going on with children, I believe. And luckily, my children are, pretty good. All kids are a little bit ADHD, I think, these days, and all entitled. But the interesting thing I think about this is how much I believe in what I do, that I swear if my child ever sort of needed some sort of, ADHD medication, like he was at a certain age, like 13, 15, 16, I swear I would take him to the Netherlands and microdose with him first for a week or two and watch it happen. That's how much I believe in this stuff and how safe and effective I actually believe it is. And again, I'm not a medical doctor, but this is just from what my use is and the information that I have from the data we've collected within the company. Not to sound too polarizing, but I'm just trying to open up people's minds on how generally I feel about how healthy this product is. And I'm really hoping that government authorities will continue to listen, especially to individuals like Dr. Michael Hart. So I appreciate your time.
Well, I appreciate having you on here and everything that you're doing. Sharing the personal anecdotes, I think, was awesome. And then also too, everything about your company and what the research you guys are doing and sharing that has been super helpful as well. So, be happy to chat again with you sometime soon, Todd. And thanks so much again, everyone, for listening. And as always, I'll be back with another episode soon.